Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for this packed house and joining our session today. Today, we're going to talk about our all-in strategy at Rutgers Camden and what we even mean by the terms all-in. We will share with you our K-12 efforts from the Office of Civic Engagement, and we begin and how we began our intentional educational pipeline as a campus, which is the start of our all-in strategy. The university began to think more systematically and critically about access and equity and what it meant for our students at Rutgers Camden, specifically our first-generation students and our underrepresented students of color. And the story we're going to share with you today is not a linear story. It's not a story with an end. It may seem as if we had great intentionality when we began this work 10 years ago. We did not. So hopefully, if you take anything away from that, is that there is always room to shape your work and to grow. And I can't say that when we thought about our K-12 work, when we were doing this at the beginning, that we even thought when we started after-school programs or even college access programs, what would happen on the other side for those young people? What would happen after they left our after-school program? What would happen after they left our college access efforts? But we are now starting to think more broadly about that work at the university, and we're starting to think about access. We're starting to think about affordability, not just for the young people who came through our K-12 programs, but for young people in general, especially in the state of New Jersey, who want to have a chance at education. So our work has been a progression, and it still is a work in progress, but all the work you'll hear about today is in response to issues that we heard directly from the community, directly from the city of Camden. It also is in direct response to larger conversations that all of us as higher education institutions are hearing about in terms of college affordability, and also our desire to wanting to expand the term of access and what it specifically meant for us here at Rutgers University. We wanted to more greatly ensure that the students who were entering our doors were going to leave, and they were going to leave in a timely manner, not just with an amazing education that Rutgers University could give them, but that they would leave knowing that they would not be saddled with mounds of debt. And so as we think about civic engagement, as we think about access, as we think about equity, all of those things are tied into this conversation today. So it may be slightly different than some of the things that we generally talk about here at CUMU, but I think it's something really worthwhile for all of us to consider. So on the stage, joining me, and you're going to hear from these great young men who are going to talk about our efforts, are my colleague Craig Westman, who is our Vice Chancellor for Enrollment Management, and how we, or more so how he, really developed our innovative tuition model, Bridging the Gap. And also, if you'd like some more information about our session today, we have a table right outside that talks about Bridging the Gap, and it talks about some of the other evaluation efforts that we'll be talking about. You're also going to hear from my colleague, Jason Rivera, our Vice Chancellor for Student Academic Success, who is making sure that all of the young people that either we bring in through the Office of Civic Engagement, but more broadly, the work that Craig and his team does through enrollment management, that regardless of who they are, those young people are successful at Rutgers Camden. And we're also joined by a colleague, Keith Wardrip, from the Federal Reserve Bank of Philadelphia, who is evaluating our Bridging the Gap effort and giving us great feedback about how our students are feeling about the effort, what successes and challenges they're experiencing with this new model that we've developed, where things are going well for us and where we need to tweak and make changes. So I think this is going to be an interesting dynamic, not only to hear about the early work that started this pipeline program, but to also hear from the Federal Reserve, who is evaluating this effort, to give us some solid feedback. So I want to start by giving you some context about Camden. We're so happy that CUMU is literally in our backyard. I've shared with some colleagues, in a pinch, I could walk here from the Rutgers Camden campus, and so it's great to have you all in our region. But Rutgers University Camden is located across the bridge in Camden, New Jersey. We are one of 3 main campuses of the State University of New Jersey, and we're the smallest campus. We're about 7,400 students, both graduate and undergraduate students, and have a largely commuter population. About 90% of our students commute to campus every day, and about 40% of our students are Pell eligible. with our Pell Grant population really growing, and a lot of it had to do with this Bridging the Gap effort. It grew by 600 students from fall 2016 to fall 2018. And we're situated in the city of Camden. For any presidents in the room, I hope you got the opportunity to hear from our former mayor, Dana Redd, who led a presidential conversation with our Chancellor, Phoebe Haddon, to talk about the city of Camden. And for all of you in the region, you know that Camden is in the midst of dramatic change. We have world headquarters of companies in our backyard now. We have American Water that's situated there. We have the Subaru company situated there. We're the training facility of the Philadelphia 76ers. That was a big win for us in Camden, New Jersey. But it's a city that has had more than its fair share of challenges and are still experiencing them to this day. Our crime has decreased significantly, but sadly, we were known as a high crime capital for the country. We have a challenged educational system. Unemployment has been high. There's been lack of opportunity. There's been health and wellness issues. And those things are changing. Camden Rising was the topic of our tour yesterday. It was the topic of our conversation with our Chancellor and former Mayor Phoebe Haddon, where crime is at an all-time low in Camden City, and it's because of amazing community policing efforts that were put in place a few years back that were even heralded by President Obama. Unemployment is the lowest it has been in Camden City in the past 30 years. Graduation rates are going up significantly, so things are rising in Camden, and things are still on the move. But when we started this work 10 years ago, that was not the case. And the biggest feedback we heard from community partners and educational institutions was around how could we work with young people in Camden City and make sure that they have opportunities. Because one of the biggest stats I share with people about the city of Camden is that 42% of the population in the city is under the age of 24. It's about 77,000 residents in the city, and the city is about 9 square miles. But when we began our K-12 work, it was in a time where the school district was significantly challenged. We had, of the 75 most challenged schools in the state of New Jersey, the Camden City school districts were at the very bottom. Students were not graduating high school. Less than half of them were graduating. And our population of young people who have a bachelor's degree, or anyone in the city of Camden, is about 8%. So as we started to engage, we were asked, what could we do? So we built a suite of K-12 efforts to try to address many of the issues that were existing in Camden City. And so our signature commitment to Camden comes through the Office of Civic Engagement, but it's not with the office alone, but I'm just going to share our work. And so one of the most successful efforts we started to really help young people in Camden City make the transition to college and move them on the educational pipeline was the Rutgers Future Scholars Program. This is a university-wide initiative that stems from Newark, New Brunswick, and Camden that works with young people from grades 8 through 12, surrounding them with academic supports, helping them and their families understand how to make the transition to higher education. And if they graduate college, gain acceptance to Rutgers University, Rutgers University will assist in covering the cost of their tuition. Hold that in the back of your mind because it's going to sound familiar as we talk about bridging the gap. But over the past 5 years, as we have begun to graduate young people out of high school, we've sent 150 of them to college at Rutgers University and beyond. When we started Rutgers Future Scholars, a lot of our community members said, this is great, you work with 250 young people in the city of Camden, how can you work with more? We started the Hill Family Center for College Access, which works with underrepresented young people, primarily in Camden City, but across the region, helping them and their families, again, understand this transition to higher education, FAFSA workshops, college completion, workshop panels, visits to colleges. Our intentional efforts are to make sure that young people in Camden see themselves and can see themselves in institutions of higher education. We started to think, this is great, we're working with high school young people, but we need to begin the work sooner. So we started the Rutgers Camden School Partnership, which works with young people in grades 4 through 8. Every year it varies. It's about 200 to 300 young people who are in a university-assisted community schools model. And Ira Harkavy was here today. His colleague Joanne Weeks, we worked hand in hand on how we developed this initiative, but making sure that we can bring all of the power of the university to our local elementary schools and not just infuse it in the after-school school, but infuse it during the school day and work with those young people to get them into our college access pipelines. Either that's Rutgers Future Scholars, the Hill Family Center for College Access, and move them along. But as we were doing these efforts, as I said, we did not think about what was going to happen when the Rutgers Future Scholars got into college. We were like, this is great. We're going to get young people into college. If they're going to go to Rutgers University, the university will take over. Their offices of student affairs will take over. The financial aid office is going to help them. The learning resource centers on campus will help them, and that wasn't the case. The young people were still coming back to our office, still not knowing how to navigate the systems. And one of the things, I remember having a conversation with our senior vice chancellor for leadership for finance and administration, and he said, we haven't done a good job with RFS if we're not making sure that those young people who are in the program actually graduate from Rutgers University, Camden. And so where Chancellor Phoebe Haddon came on board, she had a mission not only to expand our civic engagement efforts, but to push us a little further to say, how can we take this model? How can we think about access and affordability in a way that's greater than the 250 students that we serve here in Rutgers Camden? And so I know where my expertise stops, and she knew where the expertise of my colleagues begin. And so for the other side of that story, about hearing about our tuition model and how we sought to expand access, equity, and affordability, I'm going to turn it over to my colleague, Craig Westman, who's going to talk about our Bridging the Gap program.
Bridging the Gap program came about due to our chancellor. And our chancellor put to the leadership team to us back in 2015 to think of ways how to make education affordable to the students. Not only the students in Camden City, but the county of Camden, South Jersey, and North Jersey as well, to the residents. And so part of that push from her was to look at a way to create a new or maybe different program that could address the needs of the students that we serviced at Rutgers University, Camden. One of the things we went to is data. We wanted to make sure this was a data-driven decision and that we were looking at the data to tell us what is the data telling us as we went forward to create what became known as Bridging the Gap, but an institutional grant program. And like many schools, our merits and grant monies were tied together at the time. That is, a student may have a certain academic level of achievement, but we were looking at an EFC component as well in order to award a combined merit and grant aid. Looking at our data, we realized quickly that we needed to separate those two because of the need that we were seeing within our data for the students who were not only attending with us, but applying and then not attending anywhere. Naima talked to us about making sure that this is a working group so that we could give you good stuff to take away. So, to that end, this is information that any of you can pull from the FAFSA. This is information that we use in order to essentially create Bridging the Gap. And the importance of it is looking at programs in your FAFSA, in the data that you have, that actually show who your students are. What are their challenges? We already knew from Naima's work what the challenges were. The FAFSA data actually really opened that window a little bit more and showed us. And the items that are up before you, many of which to the group I'm speaking to may be very well known, these programs. And we looked at how many of our students were on free and reduced meal programs. We looked at supplemental nutrition assistance program. We looked at the temporary assistance for needy families program. We looked at how many students and parents noted they were part of WIC, the Women and Infants Children program run by federal grants. We looked at supplemental security income, which was important, that was helped individuals with basic necessities. How many of our students that were coming in, families noted this on their FAFSA? How many were receiving Medicaid? Another important item for low income adults, children, people with disabilities. And finally, for us, what was interesting is how many foster care students we have. Often those are our students that, institutions aren't necessarily aware of. I think we find that more in urban metropolitan universities that are sort of more tuned into that, but we had a significant number of those students. So, in looking at that, we also then went to the clearinghouse. And for your institutions, sometimes this exists in the registrar's office, sometimes it's in the institutional research office. But the clearinghouse is a nice little tool called Student Tracker. And so for those students that apply to you and don't enroll, you can find out where they went. Did they go somewhere else? What we found is when we looked at our population that, especially those within Camden City, often if they did not come to us, they went nowhere, not even to our local community college. And it told us that that's a problem, and it's something that the chancellor, when she realized that, wanted to address. We also discovered that in our undergraduate population that 57%, a survey that Jason's office did, were working 40 or more hours a week. That's a lot. That's hard. If you're trying to do well in your studies but are working that much, that puts you at a disadvantage to others that might be in the same classroom. Also, what we discovered is that many of the families that we were servicing were working class families, but they also owned businesses. Why was that important? That was important because the federal government and state governments often use your assets of a business that a family might have as a negative against receiving, for example, a full Pell. For New Jersey, it's a negative against the tuition assistance grant. When we realized, looking at that and how many students that we had that impacted, we knew that whatever we came up with, we needed to realize a program that looked at the adjusted gross income. What does that family have to live off of? Many of our families had more than one child. They may have owned a business and it may be a food cart. That food cart may be an asset of $40,000 or $50,000, but that's what they were living off of. That cart literally was providing the income for that family to survive. So we realized quickly that we needed to look not at EFC, but we needed to look at adjusted gross income. Out of all that data, and there's a lot more to this, but what came out of it was a program that we called Bridging the Gap. It was a program that was created by the institution as a program to help families make education affordable. It's a completion program as well. I think that's important. My colleague here is going to talk about completion and the importance of it is from access to completion. But it's a completion program. Students are required to earn 30 credit hours in an academic year. That includes summer, and to be in good academic standing. Why do we do that? We want them out in 4 years so that they can begin to work and earn a living wage. We also wanted to make sure that loans were less. Our average loans that our students had, according to iPads, was $28,000. For our chancellor, that was unacceptable. We had to make sure that was lowered. Bridging the Gap is the last dollar program. That is, it is applied at the very end. That is, after federal and state aid has been applied, then Bridging the Gap comes in. We do not count work study, which is important as federal aid. We count that as something that comes in even after Bridging the Gap. And again, I mentioned it, we use adjusted gross income. At the bottom of the slide, those are the levels for Bridging the Gap. And looking at adjusted gross income, 0 to 60,000, we cover 100% of tuition and the general fee that the campus has. 60 to 80, we cover 75%, and 80 to 100,000, we cover 50%. The reason we went up to 100,000 is that taxes in New Jersey are very high. And we realized, looking at our demographics and our data, that we had a lot of working class families that have 2 to 4 children in the house, and in order to make a program work, we needed to go up to that level to make education accessible. We took care of the affordability piece. I'm going to show you results here in a minute after my colleague speaks, but that's only part of the puzzle. You can have the affordability, but then once the access is provided, what do we do to get to completion? And I'll turn it over to Jason.
So Craig and I are going to do a little dance. I'm going to talk to you for a few minutes, then he'll come back, and then I'll come back, and we'll play back and forth. So as we talk about, and you heard Craig talk about us really being committed to access, we also knew that access alone was not doing service to our students. We had to be committed to completion. And so how did we think about how we get students in and then get them through? And that was where my work really comes in. And this framework that you see on the screen here is really a framework that we use to undergird all of the work that we do related to helping students achieve their fullest potential. And I choose that language very intentionally because what we know from working with our students is that success is very individualized and very different for each of our students. And so we want to make sure that they understand that we're going to do what we can to work with them to get them all the supports that they need. And the 4 buckets of literature that you see on the screen there are the ways that we go about doing that. And so we obviously, you may be very familiar with sense of belonging and high-impact practice work. The 2 that I'll highlight are identity consciousness, which really speaks to the multiplicity of identities that students bring, that they embody and bring with them into our environments, and the way that those intersections actually impact the student experience, and being very intentional about helping students navigate that. And then the other is care. And when I think about care, I'm drawing on the work of Noddings, but other critical scholars as well, Thompson and others, who really talk about the need to approach students from a holistic perspective and really understand all of their needs rather than just one. But the key here is really to engage in a mutually beneficial, agreed upon relationship where the student understands that you're going to be doing something for their benefit and they agree to receive that help. Okay, and so that's a critical part of the conversation, and it involves students in the conversation about the ways that we're going to be working with them to make sure that they're successful. One of the things that's really critically important for us as well is making sure, you saw all of the data that Craig shared about who our students are and who our potential students are. We needed to understand the entire student experience and to understand the lasting impact that our students, particularly from low-income and impoverished neighborhoods, come to us with. And then begin to think about financial aid is one aspect of the conversation, and it actually helps them to get in, but it certainly doesn't result in financial stability. And the needs that they have when they come into our institution don't go away when they join us. And so we had to be very thoughtful about the conversations we were having. And in fact, we just had another conversation last week about this very thing, thinking beyond financial aid and thinking about how to provide students with the resources that they need so that they could be successful within our community without having to worry about the challenges that come from home life. But that required that we do some community work as well, that we do some institutional work, right? That we work with our professors, that we work with our faculty and staff, that we work with our students to understand the nuances that our students bring with them and how to actually engage in some of those conversations. And so some of that work has involved faculty conversations around faculty mentoring. It's involved having conversations with our students about peer mentoring. It's involved having conversations with our staff about engaging in meaningful conversations with students that extend beyond deficit frames, right? Assuming an asset-based approach and helping students understand that they have all the resources already to be successful. We just have to help them connect to them, right? Many of them come with skills that they don't know how to transfer. We can help them bridge those gaps, for lack of a better word. So in short, our admissions alone was not going to provide the great equalizer that we hope education will be. So we knew that we had to take more of an intentional approach to making sure that students had all the resources that they needed to be successful. We'll talk more about, after Craig shares some of the successes of Bridging the Gap, we'll talk more about some of the strategies that we've put in place and some of the work we're doing explicitly, both at an executive level and then at a student level to engage in this work.
What are the results? How have we done with Bridging the Gap? It started in the fall of 2016, and some of the data I'm providing to you is preliminary 2019 census data. As of this fall, we have over 1,000 students that are Bridging the Gap recipients. 62% of Bridging the Gap students are first in their family to attend college. 55% are students of color, 45% are white, non-Hispanic. The next slide sort of shows what has happened to our incoming undergraduate class over the last 4 years. Our first year undergraduate student population in total has grown by 123%. Our first generation population has grown by 127%. Our first year African American undergraduate student population has grown by 271%. And finally, our Hispanic, first year Hispanic undergraduate population has grown by 139%. It works. I put this slide up for an important reason. Before, at our institution, the red represents white, non-Hispanic population. That used to be 58%. Today, it's 44%. The numbers I provided you in the previous slide speak to that. We have become majority minority, or as the chancellor says, we reflect the community in which we find ourselves. All the work that Naima does and the work that we have done has changed our institution. It has had a national impact. The state of New Jersey now is doing Bridging the Gap at a state level for community college students. New York has adopted it. The city of Boston now does it. We've got publics and privates that are doing it now, from the University of Chicago all the way out to Washington State. And finally, look at our retention for our Bridging the Gap students. It's higher than our non-Bridging the Gap students. That's cool. And if we put the right programs in place, it shows what happens when you make it affordable, and then what my colleague's going to talk about is how do you sustain it? How do you keep them here? And as promised, he's going to provide to you the one silver bullet that you will want.
So there is no silver bullet. Right, and that's an important part of the conversation. This takes intensive strategic work, but also collaborative work, right? And so I'm going to talk to you a little bit about the ways that we've thought about this and some of the things that we're doing, and I'm going to do that very quickly because I know we're running short on time. Okay, so our targeted and strategic approach required that, again, we involve all of our stakeholders, right? So high-quality instruction was critically important to the conversation, and we didn't want to compromise high-quality instruction. We also wanted to make sure that students were operating in a culture of high expectation, and particularly for marginalized populations, oftentimes that is not the environment that they operate in, and so we wanted to make sure that was an intentional thing embedded in our work. We wanted to make sure that we were working to eliminate systemic and structural barriers to their success, and that required ongoing conversations. It required that we look at policies and procedures and determine, are these things in place because they make our lives as professionals better, or are they to the benefit of the student? Right? Oftentimes it was to make our lives better, and so we had to revisit why it was that certain things existed and think strategically about how to change some of those things. We wanted to make sure, and this is critically important to the work, that we take a deeply human touch with all of our students. Right? And our campus size helps us with that, but it's something that we're deeply, deeply committed to, making sure that all of our students have somebody that they can connect with. And we wanted to ensure that there was greater curricular rigor, right? So we wanted our students to graduate and be able to go on to graduate school or professional work or whatever it is they chose post-graduation in a way that was meaningful. And so we took into clear consideration the life cycle of the student. How do they come to us before, which is what Naima was talking about, and then how do they leave us, and what are we doing to support them as they leave us? All of that leads to greater levels of both retention and graduation, which is critically important in our students' lives. All right, so we also have done some things at the executive level to ensure that we're taking a coordinated and strategic approach. This idea of an all-in and equity-grounded, equity-conscious culture is one that comes from the top. Our chancellor is very committed to this work, and all of her leadership team has bought into that level of commitment. And so one of the things that we've done is we've begun to use data much more regularly to inform the conversations that we have. We have data briefs. We have campus-wide data briefs to talk about the ways that data is telling us about how our students are doing. We have, we're an EAB campus, and so we use predictive analytics. And one of the things we do is we have midterm progress reports. In fact, this is the last week of our progress reporting window. We send information out to faculty once that window closes about how students are performing and what the aggregate data has told us about students and what's going on at an earlier point in the semester so we can continue to sort of provide the interventions that students need. We also have reviewed course data and looked at high DFW and I courses and had conversations with our deans and department chairs about things we can be doing. Are these things curricular? Are they pedagogical? Are they student-based? Do we need to leverage academic supports in a different way for this particular population? So those are conversations that we have. We've implemented a renewed advising and retention council so that we're allowing the advisors to be part of the leaders in the conversations about how advising happens and the impact that it has on students. But we've also expanded it so that it includes representation from faculty, it includes representation from the staff, and now we're talking about how we engage students and include students in that conversation. We have collaborative meetings between student affairs, enrollment management, and student success. And that's where we have a lot of the conversations about these structural issues and these barriers that exist. And those are regular standing meetings where we are able to bring cases to the conversation or just provide updates about things that are going on within our respective areas. We also have looked at how we leverage financial aid differently. Aside from Bridging the Gap, and we've talked about Bridging the Gap, we have created something called a Raptor Rising Grant, right? It's a gap grant for those seniors who are approaching graduation. They do not have to apply for this. We actually review our data and determine who has a balance that's less than $2,000 and just apply it to their account so that they don't have to worry about how to make up that difference. And then finally, one of the things that we are very committed to is working with our faculty, right? And we do that both formally and informally. Every year we have something called a Raptor Impact Conference, which is targeting faculty and talking about a student experience or some kind of impact that faculty can have on students. But then we also do lunch and learns with our faculty. And we go into the schools on a semesterly basis and invite faculty to join us for conversations around new information that's coming out in their respective fields, different things that are coming up around how to support them in student success and such. And then finally, we also do things that are student-facing and work with our students on. So one of the things that we've done is we've looked at our onboarding processes. We've looked at the way that we orient students to our campus, and we've front-loaded some of the support strategies that they need, and really thought strategically about how to make sure that they have access to success strategies up front. We built a program that was originally designed for Bridging the Gap called Roadmaps to Success. When we found that the program had a 98% retention rate for our Bridging the Gap students, we then expanded it for all of our students. And so we have a program now called Roadmaps to Success where some schools have decided to adopt it as a requirement and other programs are using it as part of their study process. We increased our personal student touch. When we found that in looking at our data, we had students who were leaving us without anybody touching them, we implemented something called retention counseling. And so any student who was going to be withdrawing from the campus from all of their courses was required to see one of my success coaches and have a conversation about whether there was anything we could do to prevent them from withdrawing before they left. And then we actually implemented a process to follow up with those students who had no choice but to leave to make sure there was nothing we could do to get them back in. And we do that on a semesterly basis. We have targeted programming for students. One of the things we found when we analyzed our data is that one of our lowest retained groups is our Latino males. So we have a targeted program for our Black and brown males to make sure that they have all of the resources that they need to be successful. And then finally, we can't forget including parents in the conversation. And so we do things to involve parents in the conversation. We go to where parents are to make sure that we're meeting them at spaces and places where they can actually join us without having to worry about childcare and all of those things. I'm happy to talk about more of this after we're done. I'm going to turn it over to my colleague, Keith.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm the guy who's going to try not to eat into too much of your coffee break. So forgive me if I kind of breeze through the presentation here. As Naima mentioned, my name is Keith Wardrip. I'm the Community Development Research Manager at the Federal Reserve Bank of Philadelphia. Craig and Jason did an amazing job of describing the Bridging the Gap program to you, so I don't have to do any of that. I'm just going to talk about some early results from our ongoing analysis of the program. Right after I mentioned that my views are not necessarily those of the Federal Reserve Bank of Philadelphia or the Federal Reserve System, right? They make me say it. So just a little bit about our research design. As soon as the program was announced, my department reached out to Craig and his team about the possibility of conducting an evaluation of this exciting new program. And to Craig and the entire administration's credit, they were eager and enthusiastic and excited to partner with us, and they've been engaged throughout. The way we designed the research is as a mixed methods evaluation. So on the quantitative side, we're following the inaugural fall 2016 cohort for 5 years, and we're comparing their traditional academic performance data like credit hours completed, GPA, persistence and completion, graduation. We're comparing them with similar students from the prior 2 years. And then qualitatively, we are scheduling between 20 and 25 interviews with Bridging the Gap participants, again from that initial cohort, for every 5 years. We're about to embark on I think our 4th round of interviews in a few weeks. We've released 2 reports to date. The first was based purely on some interviews that we conducted with Rutgers Camden administration about the goals for the program, as well as with 20 or so students in their first college semester to ask them to reflect on their first semester and on their application process. A report last year was a full sort of year 1 evaluation, so we supplemented the qualitative data with academic performance after 1 year, and early in 2020 we're going to start our year 3 evaluation. So I'm going to start by talking a little bit about what we learned regarding the application and enrollment process from students. So we spoke with students in their first semester, asking them to reflect on their application and enrollment process. And one thing we heard was that college affordability was a primary driver in where they applied, and Bridging the Gap was a major factor in why they decided to enroll at Rutgers Camden. You can see and I'll show throughout my presentation a few illustrative quotes from the interviews. So Bridging the Gap had a clear message of college affordability, and it really resonated with the students. We also heard from a number of students about sort of an aversion to student loans. And we heard from, again, a few students about how the Bridging the Gap program allowed them to start their college career at a 4-year institution as opposed to starting at a community college and then transferring. And the findings from these interviews were largely backed up by our analysis of enrollment data. On this chart, you can see that when we look at the yield rate or the share of in-state admitted tuitions who enrolled at Rutgers Camden, in the fall of 2016, for that cohort, it was 2.6 percentage points higher than for the prior 2 years. And that's a material difference. So I think the yield rate increased from about 10% to about 13%. So that's a real difference. You can see the effects are a little bit stronger for African American students and for students with an adjusted gross income of below $60,000. Just for reference, when I refer to lower income students throughout my presentation, I'm talking about the group with the AGI below 60,000, and I'll call the group between 60 and 100,000 middle income students. So through the course of the interviews, we learned that the Bridging the Gap award, the aid, wasn't just an inducement to enroll, but it also played a role in reducing students' financial anxiety. So students reported lower stress levels and said the program helped them focus on their studies. And this was a message we heard in particular from middle-income students who might have had income too high to qualify for other sources of need-based aid, but received a Bridging the Gap award. While it did reduce the level of financial anxiety, it did not erase it completely. Most of these students were responsible for paying for their non-tuition expenses, whether it's room and board, transportation, books, supplies, et cetera. The students for these expenses needed to have cash on hand, right? And a number of students, even those who qualified for the full tuition discount, still took out student loans. I think about half of the interviewees in our first round of interviews said they had taken out student loans to cover some of these costs. I think this slide would surprise a different audience, but I'm sure it will come as no surprise to you that students at Rutgers University have substantial costs that exceed tuition and fees. So for commuter students, tuition and fees only represent about 54% of total costs. The leftover expenses are substantial and can be a real financial hardship for some students. So let's talk for just a second about the delivery of the aid. So there was no separate application process, but that's not to say that the receipt of the aid was necessarily seamless. We heard from students that there was some level of confusion and frustration in working with the financial aid office. It is, we believe, in large part due to the structure of these last dollar financial aid programs. A lot of the confusion and complication came around really nailing down the level of support they were getting from federal and state need-based programs. And so it was kind of a moving target, and some students ended up with sort of surprise expenses on their term bills because of the fluctuation in these other sources of aid. And this was backed up by some of our quantitative analysis. What we found is that for lower income students, more than a third of these students received a Bridging the Gap award that was at least 20% below what we expected based on the access to the other financial data that we had. Now this was as of late fall 2016. In conversations with Craig and others, we realized that students, the awards may have been adjusted in the spring to fill the gap, or it may be that the award was not needed because other sources of need-based aid filled the gap on its own. But I think this led to some general, again, confusion, frustration, and I think it introduced some uncertainty in the students' minds about whether or not they could trust the financial aid process and whether or not they could continue with their education. A couple of other themes emerged from our interviews, and one was the need to balance school and work. When we talked with students early on in their first semester, we found that most of them worked through high school and planned to continue working through college. In part, it was for some it was due to financial necessity, but some students really expressed that work was just sort of part of being an adult. It was part of being an independent, mature adult. That's what one does, right? After a year of college, some of those students realized that it was difficult to balance a heavy workload and an academic course load. College was more rigorous than high school, and those who could, it seemed, tried to stop working or reduce their hours, but not everyone could, right? For some, working continued to be a necessity, and this is a good reminder that these students, even with the Bridging the Gap award, do face some level of precariousness in their financial situation. And the second theme was around a general lack of familiarity with program requirements. And I don't think that's specific to Bridging the Gap. I think that's probably a universal truism, that there's some confusion around what's required to maintain what level of what type of aid. But that certainly emerged in our interviews. It seems that maintaining a 2.0 GPA was not really a hardship for students, but that earning 30 credit hours each year was. That's where a lot of students were tripped up. They didn't know about the requirement going in, so they either had to take more classes in the spring or take summer classes. And we did find that summer enrollment was critical in helping some students meet their requirements. So ultimately, we wanted to answer one question in this year one analysis. So were students in the fall 2016 cohort, as compared to the 2 prior years, more likely to earn 30 credit hours, earn a 2.0 GPA, and re-enroll at Rutgers Camden? And I think I can say that the resounding answer is yes, but. So on this slide, what you can see is that the lower income students, the middle income students, there were significant and substantial increases in their rate of earning their 30 hours at 2.0 and re-enrolling. But we found the same to be true for a group that did not have a tuition gap, right? So they didn't receive any Bridging the Gap award, but we saw similar levels of improvement for those students. We think that has to do with changes that Rutgers Camden made to pre-registration and to advising. So we can't attribute any of these benefits directly to the Bridging the Gap program yet. This was a year one evaluation. We're about to conduct the year 3 evaluation, and maybe I can return to the conference in a couple of years to share the results. So lastly, my wrap-up slide is that students are definitely responsible to clear messaging around college affordability, that many first-year students do need some additional support around the financial aid process. Even though the Bridging the Gap did relieve some financial anxiety, a lot of these students still need a financial cushion to cover other costs. Summer term was particularly important in helping students meet these high academic requirements, and that being responsive to student feedback can help identify and address implementation challenges.
So thank you so much, everyone, for being here today. We have just a minute or so left, and I wanted to know if my colleagues had any final responses that they'd like to share with the group. One of the things I think I've taken from how we've begun to think about access and equity at Rutgers Camden is that it has to be not only a concentrated effort at the level of your leadership, meaning your president or your chancellor, but the leadership team has to continually be in conversation and having their staffs in conversations on how you really enact this work. And so it means that, for the people who work in my office in the K-12 space. They have to have connections with the people in Jason's office who are doing EOF and TRIO and the student support. They have to constantly talk to the teams in Craig's office about admissions and enrollment and financial aid and back and forth. So it's not just, leaving it on Craig to create the model, admit the students, but it's this back and forth we have as leaders at the institution. That's the only way all of this is going to be successful. And then having someone from the outside look at it. Give us that feedback, evaluate us, tell us what's going wrong, tell us that our students don't quite understand what we're asking them to do, and then how do we go back and change our orientations, our open houses, our information sessions to students and their families so that they understand what they're getting into, but also the supports that are going to be provided. So, we can use this as continuous improvement. So any final things before we go? Okay, well, thank you so much, everyone, for spending your afternoon with us. We really appreciate it.